Hi there guys, welcome to this tutorial on War Photographer, and in this video I'm going to be comparing War Photographer with the poem Remains, looking at an exam style question and how I would respond to that. So I've made up a question today which is comparing the ways that poets present inner conflict in War Photographer and one other poem. Obviously in the exam you're going to have your poem in front of you, blank copy, and you're going to be required to choose and select an appropriate poem to go with it. So when I think about inner conflict, to me there's a couple of poems that spring to mind, maybe Kamikaze being one, but the one that really springs to mind for me is Remains, which focuses obviously on the soldier's experience of post-traumatic stress disorder following his time serving his country and the experiences that he goes through with that. But I'm going to start with the poem that's in front of me because it's unlikely you're going to be able to remember dozens and dozens of quotes for all the different poems. So it's really important in terms of demonstrating your AO2 skill that you focus in on the poem that's in front of you. So if you can remember some context, that's great. So things that I've remembered about War Photographer is the context, in terms of context, is that Caroline Duffy, of course, was inspired and intrigued by her own friendship with a war photographer. That sort of sense really that as part of that job, much of the challenge is that you're recording horror and suffering, but you're ultimately quite helpless to intervene or to help, and really that causing you a sense of anxiety and shame, because you're not participating, you're just observing and taking pictures, and ultimately as a war photographer it's your job, it's how you make money, so it's an uneasy kind of feeling about making money off the suffering of others. So I've highlighted a few different things that I'm going to think about, and as you were going through your exam you obviously got 45 minutes for this question, which is a decent amount of time, and you need to be spending at least 5 minutes of that planning. So I'm going to focus on here in the dark room. Now a dark room is just somewhere where you would develop your own pictures, but also I think that this has got some, a dark room. It feels quite isolated and quite bleak as well, so I think there's some sort of dual meaning there. And we see that the photographer is finally alone. Maybe there's a sense of exhaustion there, that they're just craving peace and quiet, with spools of suffering set out in ordered rows. So in terms of technique we have that sibilance, spools of suffering. And note here that it's plural, it's more than one spool of suffering. And it's obviously referring here to all the photos he's taken whilst he's been travelling and documenting the suffering that's he's seen. In terms of structural techniques, look here at these single word sentences, each one of them an iconic war zone or place of suffering. And this almost dismissive tone that Duffy uses here, all flesh is grass, that he's seen so many dead bodies on the ground that it just becomes as everyday and as normal as a field of grass would to us. We have here almost a sense of the justification, he's got a job to do, and again this makes us feel quite uneasy, as I mentioned at the beginning, this sense of someone who is profiting or making money off the suffering of others. But here is the heart of it, this sense of inner conflict, and his hands which did not tremble then, though seem to now. So his hands are actually shaking, and this might suggest a sense of trauma. Certainly he is upset by the things that he has seen, and somehow he's managed to focus when he's in that war zone, and yet here when he's back home the trauma seems to come out more. And there's something here about being back in this ordinary environment, being at home, and it talks about here where the fields don't explode beneath the feet of running children, and obviously focusing on landmines here and some of the devastating effects in a nightmare heat. So he's talking, or he's reflecting and remembering on some of these war zones and places that he's been to, and the sort of horrors that he's experienced. The idea of children being blown up by landmines is particularly evocative and poignant. In this third stanza then we get this ambiguity, something is happening. This idea, we're not clear what, but the photos are here coming to life, and we see that a stranger's features faintly start to twist before his eyes, a half-formed ghost. There's some real irony here. You know, the image as it is developing is ghostly and pale, and yet also the victims that he has seen and that he has photographed, they're also ghosts because they've died. And here, in terms of this inner conflict, he remembers the cries. So these images are provoking or triggering the real life memories for him. These are not just images, they're attached to people as well. And it says, you know, how he sought approval without words to do what someone must, and how the blood stained into foreign dust. So we get here this sense of guilt and shame that I mentioned earlier. He wants somebody to say, you've got to do it, someone needs to. And yet the images that remain with him are blood staining into the dust. And as you know, that I've already mentioned that I chose Remains as my poem, and I think that there's actually quite a nice link there, in that when the soldier's going back out on patrol, he's walking over I think he calls it the blood shadow, and so that idea that it's hard to get past something because you see it again and again and again. And actually what I'll do now at this point is I'm going to mention here about something here to do with the guilt that occurs in both of these poems. So I'm going to mention here about the bloodstain, and here I'm going to mention that metaphor, which, let me remember actually what I just said. It was the of the blood shadow, and it's a good idea of mentioned before in videos about using this idea of subject, what happens, style, the language features and structure, how it's being put together. And I think it's a good idea to have this mini table that you fill with things as you're going along. We see here that this repeated image, 100 agonies in black and white. We talk about black and white as things being factual, so as well as it being the images, it's reinforcing that these are just hard and fast facts of the world. And then we get here really from Duffy, we get a provoking image or criticism of our response to the images that we see. So the editor, the War Photographer's editor, is picking out 5 or 6 images, and as a newspaper or a Sunday supplement, these images have got to be the worst, haven't they? They've got to evoke strong and powerful images. And you think about a year or so ago when the young boy was washed up on the beach, you know, that he was drowned and he was in the soldier's arms, and it had sort of public outcry and grief. Well, this is the same, isn't it? But for these guys it's much more cynical because they're trying to sell newspapers. And look at her criticism here: the reader's eyeballs prick with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers. So it's this idea of all of this suffering is just, you know, we kind of consume the grief, but it's just, you know, something like, oh, isn't that sad? Actually, let's get back on with our lives between a bath and a beer. And this, it's quite unsettling, and it's intended to shame us as readers into thinking about our own responsibility to the wider world. We get here some of this, it's kind of like repeated assonance would be the technique for it. When we get the aeroplane stares at where they do not care, and so with this we get the adverb impassively, so it's left on a really bleak tone as the war photographer's flying off to his next location, and this sort of tired, repetitive, monotonous life that he leads of flying and staring out. But here, if you're impassive, you don't care, or you're desensitized. And so I'm going to put that word in there, desensitized. It's a good word. And because I know that it's a good word for war photographer, but it also links into remains, where the soldier has become desensitized to the horror of the war zone that he's seen. And Duffy, just kind of going back to this last line here, we've got this irony of the word living. He earns his living, and they, meaning the victims of war zones who have obviously been killed, don't care. How can they care? They've been killed. And so we get the irony of his living, meaning his wage and his money, but also the fact that he has his life, he can just fly out of there, whereas these people are stranded in these horrific conditions. So what I would be doing is I've done a good deal of annotation there, and then I would be looking to do my plan here. I've already got a few ideas in here, but I'm going to just sum up a few of the bits and pieces. So I'm going to put the listing here of war zones. I'm going to talk about, in terms of style, I think that verb tremble to describe his hand shaking shows something about his trauma that he's going through. I'm going to think about that phrase, he sought approval. And again, I think that really conveys something of the inner conflict. In terms of subject, well, we've talked through a number of the things around him being a war photographer, and some of those elements of context, to remind ourselves that this is a soldier in the Middle East. That Armitage really focuses on the idea of post-traumatic stress disorder. And I'm just going to make a little note here to remind myself that there was a documentary featuring soldiers who Armitage was inspired by. So structurally, I'm going to think about, well, I know, I can't remember lots, I haven't got remains in front of me, but I know that there's the repetition of probably armed, which again shows something of this soldier's sort of doubt. And also I'm going to mention here we've got the alliteration of I know that another quote is about drink and drugs, and again, don't know if you can't remember the exact wording of the quote, something here around the coping mechanism. So a brief plan like this is well worth doing, it's well worth spending a bit of time thinking about some of your points of comparison. What I've just got here is, here's one I made earlier. So rather than writing it out for you now, I've already had a go at this response, but just to go through, this would be not a complete level 9 response, but certainly it has all the elements and attributes of a level 9 response to that question. I think, as I've said before, it's a really good idea to begin a response with both, because it shows the examiner that you can link together the two poems and make a clear point of comparison. So I've started with both War Photographer and Remains, present readers with people who are struggling to cope with extreme situations they've experienced, and as a result, both the photographer in War Photographer and the soldier in Remains display troubled consciences, and dark inner conflict. So that would be sort of my opening point. And what I would then do is really anchor a lot of my AO2 into war photography, because I've got that poem in front of me. So I'm going to continue. In War Photographer, Duffy uses the sibilant spools of suffering and lists locations the photographer has visited, Belfast, etc. In order to show that this conflict is ongoing, the photographer must replay every horrific image he has seen. Duffy, inspired and intrigued by her own friendship with the war photographer, is highlighting the challenges of a job which requires people to take pictures of running children or 100 agonies, yet prevents them from helping. So I've got in here some context, because I've talked about the fact that Duffy, as we know, was inspired by that friendship. I've obviously got some use of terminology, because I've talked about the sibilance, and I've also managed to get in some structure when I focused there on lists. Ba, ba, dab, dab. Bear with me, it's highlighting. Prevents them from helping. The war photographer sought approval, nice embedded quote, for not intervening, showing how he is constantly conflicted about not helping the people he photographs. I should have put a paragraph in that. By the end of the poem, the bleak message is clear. Duffy's use of the adverb impassively indicates that the man, although conflicted, is desensitised and sees this job as a way to make his living, which ironically is at the expense of others' deaths. So I've got some language in here, and let's have a look. I'm focusing very much on Duffy and what she's using. And then I'm coming in here with my comparison, because in order to be getting those really top marks in this exam, you are going to be needing to have sustained comparison. So I'm going to make that link to remains. Likewise in remains, so comma there. Armitage shows that although the soldier is conflicted about whether the looter should have been shot, probably armed, possibly not, he is forced to get on with life because it is simply part of his job, regardless of the horrendous PTSD which causes him poignantly to rely on drink and drugs. And you know, your evaluation, again, it can just be a single word like that within your explanation, the idea that it is quite poignant and quite emotional that this soldier is now relying on drink and drugs. So for this response, I would be looking for a couple of sort of twice as much of this, even if you could a little bit more. But certainly this is, embedded quotes, clear points that link to the question about inner conflict, interpreting, focusing on Duffy or the poet's purpose, and also incorporating some context. Okay, thanks for watching.